Hi, everyone. Welcome to Roses All Trash, the accompanying podcast to Read Community, which is a monthly reading calendar that we produce. I'm Catherine.
I'm Ryan.
Our first reading is going to be by Robert McClure. Native American Peacemaking Courts Offer a Model for Reform. And it's pretty much what the title says. It's a discussion of the way Native American courts have been based off of tribal customs and provide an alternative type of justice rather than the traditional US criminal justice system, and the way that's more affirming to victims, and the way it gives people who are bringing forth a case against someone else, it gives both the victim and the accused an active role in the restoration of justice, thus humanizing both of the participants.
Our second reading is by Arnett, Ferguson, Bad Boys, Public Schools, and Making of Black Masculinity. We're specifically reading chapter 2, which is entitled The Punishing Room. So, of course, she goes into a description of the punishing room, it's like a social services room next to or nearby the principal's office where you're sent basically if you get in trouble in your regular classroom. And so it should be a place where discipline really rules. But the room is shaped by the fact that the kids who converge here from all grades, I think throughout middle school, they know it's a place for bad kids. They know where they're going. Quote, for the children, it is a place of knowing that one is not alone. The child who gets in trouble is the norm. It is a space in the school in which everyone is like yourself, in trouble, and you are no longer different. But it's also where the files with like disciplinary records are kept, very specifically. Like if a child graffitis something on a desk, that exact message will be written down word for word into the file. So every time a kid is dragged there again, this very non-metaphorical folder is opened up. And it's also where busy, upset parents are called to discuss detentions, suspensions, expulsions. And so there's this like imposition of school and county policy also on this child's identity. Quote, the punishing room is a focal point of intersecting and contradictory ideas of how and why so many African American boys are found in spaces like this one all across the nation. The idea is that no kid who comes here does not know why they're there. And that kind of goes contrary to what we think, right? Like kids are bad because they don't know any better or something like that. But every kid who comes here knows, okay, I'm a bad kid now. And so they don't just bring in personal baggage, but they bring in racialized baggage, gendered baggage, socioeconomic baggage. Our last reading is by Annalise Acorn. I love her name. It's so cute. Annalise Acorn, Restorative Justice Compared to What? Acorn, so cute. Acorn has studied restorative justice, among other things, throughout her career, which spans like 2 decades almost. And she has drastically changed her opinion on restorative justice a few times. She actually wrote a book that was kind of like debunking or expressing disappointment with restorative justice outcomes. So she does admit, like other people, like other critics of restorative justice, to disappointing outcomes, which are often due to inconsistent implementation of restorative justice practices. But in this particular paper, Restorative Justice Compared to What?, she examines a specific landmark court case against a Canadian Indigenous person, and she discusses the dual use of essentially colonialist Canadian law and Indigenous legal traditions, which are more restorative. So not only did this case mark a possible shift toward restorative or anti-incarceral, anti-imprisonment justice, but it also moves, quote, towards acknowledging the role colonialism, residential schools, poverty and addiction, and the like suffered by Indigenous people through the direct fault of the Canadian state have played in Indigenous crime. And these have actually come to be called Gladue factors or a Gladue report. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it is after the defendant in this landmark case. I think, a sort of application to US law would be like, sure, we convict whether this person is guilty or not of a crime, but then the actual sentence is considered through the lens of like what other factors were involved in leading this person to the crime, and thus is the person likely to commit the crime again. I don't know if we have a specific name for that, like a name for those factors, but it's a familiar idea. Because like a lot of criminal justice is built on this idea of retributivism, I think is what it's called, where it's like, okay, if we get the person for the crime and the judge and the jury will appropriately decide what this person can do to make up their debt to society and also to the person they committed the crime against.
What you said about this melding of the existing court system and like restorative justice, in terms of like the existing court system is useful for like determining whether or not someone is guilty, but then the punishment needs to be given in consideration of the circumstances of the person and of the crime and whether or not it's likely to occur again and the motivations behind it. Say we had, I mean, didn't we pass that law in California about abolishing the bail system? Let me look this up.
I remember voting for that, voting for that, and also just like on the ballot. No?
No, it did not pass, which is unfortunate, because what it would attempt to do is to abolish cash bail systems. And instead of that, the accused would be released based off of an assessment by the judge. The defendant would put forth the case for why or why not they should be released. And then the judge would make a decision based off of like risk assessment in terms of whether or not they're a danger of society, whether or not they're going to flee, etc., instead of having a cash bail system, because obviously the cash bail system is wildly unfair. Even if you are found not guilty of a crime, if you're not able to pay for the bail system, you can still be held in jail for years.
Right. I think there's a lot of other issues, like just to talk about that cash bail system, because really the bail system would try to protect people's liberty, right? Like if you can, even through taking out a loan, do that and then be able to go to work and be able to be better equipped, find your resources, be with your family. Like there is that sort of individual right at play there. But to get rid of the cash bail system would also maybe prevent families from falling into predatory debt. Yeah. You can see those anywhere in like big cities, these like really seedy, rundown, like lone places. And it's interesting because places like that actually become community fixtures. Like this is really, I don't know if this is good, but there's a biblical metaphor of like the tax collector and how these tax collectors do end up part of the community. Have you ever watched the movie Good Time? I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't bring it up because I'll get on a tangent.
The movie what?
Robert Pattinson is in this movie called Good Time. He's basically trying, like he's doing his goddamn best to bail out his younger brother who has some sort of like executive functioning disorder, like developmental disorder, and I won't talk about that anymore. But
it's the movie Midnight Run, which is about a bail bondsman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So another thing is, of course, like having the bail system cuts down on delays. So there's a chance in reality that the bail system would allow people to get out of jail quicker, which also alleviates pressure on the court system. But I mean, this is all really bringing me to like Annalise Acorn's essay, because one of the main things she brings up is like, realistically speaking, what are the alternatives to restorative justice that are available to people? And in these cases, even if restorative justice is not like ideal, is it the best option? And I do think like getting rid of the cash bail system would be a huge step forward, despite that like the real outcomes that could maybe contradict like what it was intended to do in the first place,
But there was a man who was a black man who was incarcerated for, I believe it was stealing a backpack, and couldn't afford bail. And he spent like 8 years in prison and ended up committing suicide in prison. The cash bail system like isn't, if people can't afford it, it's not only do they fall into like predatory loan systems or like cycles, if they can't afford even just like the upfront payment to get the loan itself, they can be stuck in jail for years.
That's literally the plot of Good Time. Robert Pattinson commits like 1 million crimes in one night, just trying to get the whatever $10,000 in order like to afford the loan. He like runs into some people and he's like, "Oh, you guys have drugs? Can I like move some of it for you?" And then like it ends up all crazy. As long as we're talking about this sort of system, this carceral system, we could talk about the current state of the school to prison pipeline.
Well, depending on your perspective, either bad or great. If you're the people profiting off of it, it's in great shape.
Well, yeah.
If you're anyone else.
Do you want to describe it?
It's a self-perpetuating cycle set up to punish Black and brown people, but specifically Black people, often Black men. It sort of begins like in school, like specifically Black boys are labeled like unruly or violent or they're disrespectful for behavior that other children also exhibit because they're children and they're testing boundaries and learning about the environment and they don't know better. After they've been punished and like sent to the punishing room or whatever iteration of that the school has, they themselves recognize themselves as bad children or like bad people and see themselves as bad, which creates a cycle of them often acting out more or fulfilling the narratives that they're bad because that's what they've been told. And as they get into more and more trouble, they do worse and worse in school, which, puts them into even more trouble. They, could drop out. And it sort of it primes them not to succeed in school and move on to higher education. It primes them not to participate in after school activities and instead end up in maybe less desirable activities or communities or in gangs, and then therefore go straight to jail.
The major factor, of course, is racism, straight up racism, good old-fashioned racism. But then another two factors that are really brought into this is, one, the idea of dysfunctional families. It's become like a really like liberal flagship point to be like, oh, dysfunctional families, like you have to be careful, like bring your kids into the world. And people, I think, don't understand how that also is like a horrible thing to say and a really racist thing to say, because it's this idea that like, oh, an average Black family is less likely to be able to raise their children well than the average white family. Makes no sense. It definitely is something else. It's second point, which is the lack of resources. The reason why schools label and like kind of categorize their kids is the fact that they don't have the resources to take care of every kid, right? They don't have the resources to pour into, for example, if you did track kids into like gifted, regular, and low performing math classes, instead of our logic being like, okay, let's pour extra money into the low performing so we can raise the average standard overall. The idea is like, all right, we're sorting these kids so that we know where to concentrate our resources. It's because schools operate on this like really like scarcity based model. And so you can't it's hard to blame teachers when they have 30 to 40 kids in a room. Like it makes, how can you give all of the kids the same amount of attention? And so often the punishing room is used to just alleviate teachers' burdens. And then these kids know where they're going, they know why they're going. And when you're trying to like figure out your identity, that's when the labels really take an effect. Ferguson, in the beginning of her book and in the epilogue, she describes how when she first came into the school to interview kids for her project, the principal just casually pointed to this kid passing by and then said like, oh, there's a jail cell with his name on it. And she was shocked, right? But then by the end of the book, she was like, but I think that like, obviously not in the way that the principal said it, but I think it's true. Like, I think ultimately it is more likely that this child will end up going to jail and going to prison than going on to higher education. That's the pipeline for you. Obviously, the whole thing is horrible. But there's something within it that really irks me, which is how the state or the government at any level is pushing the responsibility of solving social issues onto, and literally anyone else, onto private prisons, onto even like not private prisons, state-owned prisons, onto teachers at the individual level, onto principals who have to decide whether they're going to make more money in like a nicer district. Also those principals may not have had the most privileged backgrounds, and so they are sort of shuffled into less desirable districts instead of the government creating, funding, and implementing preventative policy or anti-inequality policy.
And like you said about lack of resources, so many schools are funded by the income taxes of the neighborhood around it. And that funding is what determines like things like class size and, what type of teachers they end up hiring and the resources that they have for the students and after school programs that can really help develop students' passions and interests. And like that's something I think a lot about, like having grown up in Palo Alto in our school districts, because it's a town of multimillionaires and multi-billionaires. And so the amount of programs and extra electives and like super specific classes and resources like for English language learners and people with learning impairments and so on. And also just like in terms of smaller class sizes and like really good technology and things like that.
I mean, our public high school had an endowment in like the millions of dollars. That's like so unheard of. And what motivates people to create that endowment is because it's not just nostalgia for the high school that they went to, but because they want to maintain that level of prestige. They also have roots in the neighborhood. They have companies in the neighborhood. they have stock that actually depends on how livable the town is. And so that's why that's the incentive for pouring money into our schools. Don't think it's going to be like actually like, oh, we want to make sure everyone gets a good education in Palo Alto. No. It's always the fiscal incentive.
I mean, maybe this was my lack of self-awareness, but like when I went to college and met other people and talked about high school experiences with other people, the thing that like really, I said this and people were like, what the fuck? And this wasn't our public high school, but the other public high school in the town has a glass blowing studio. And that's courses that you can take there is in glass blowing as part of their art program. And we're not even an arts focused school. This is the heart Silicon Valley. So our high schools are very focused on tech, on like math and science. And that's the majority of our like our extra programs are. But they had this glass blowing studio. And I mentioned that. And people were like, are you insane?
I didn't do any like fine art in high school, but I did do orchestra for a year. And I remember, I mean, our orchestra goes to like competitions and stuff. I don't really know all the language. Again, I was only in it for a year, but like other schools, they do these yearly competitions, and we always got the highest or second highest marks possible, according to like a few different judges. And that's not because like we're just better at playing the fucking violin than like it's because there's so many people within the orchestra who also are able to afford private lessons. And so that also is an investment that doesn't really show up on our property taxes. It doesn't show up in our endowment, but it's an investment made nonetheless. And so it's also partly to like raise the standards even more, because when you are from a competitive school, that's also taken into account upon your grades. So even if you are going to this great school, but you can't afford private lessons or something, you're going to struggle because the standard of performance is higher, you know?
That's something I've been thinking about recently is I walk past Castellea like every day on my way back home from work. Castellea is a private school in our hometown. It starts in 6th grade and it goes up until the end of high school, until 12th grade. It's an all-girls school. I know a couple of people who went there. It's, a very good school. It's super high quality. Its tuition is higher than my college tuition was, and I had a high college tuition, so it's a very expensive private school. There's like been this ongoing like argument or like war or whatever going on in the neighborhood where Castellea I believe they want to add more students, but then what would happen is more students would come in more cars and there's not enough parking in the neighborhood, and a lot of people who live around Castellea are angry that all the high schoolers are parking their cars on the street and taking up their street parking. This is the stupidest argument ever. Like, really, it doesn't matter. Even the people who live in the neighborhood, they don't own the street parking. I get that it's an inconvenience for them, but life goes on. But there are all these signs. People put signs in the yards about like Castellea, stop the expansion, or like work with the neighborhood, or like, But then the ones that are pro Castellea have all these signs that say like support women's education. And that's something that it always bothered me and I never got why. And then I realized that what bothers me is that like, okay, maybe Castellea is adding these students. And like, yeah, they are girls, they're women. I guess you are supporting like women's education, girls' education. But what type of girls can afford to go to Castellea? These are the girls who are going to have the best of everything, regardless of whether or not they got to go to this private school. If you can afford to send your child to Castellea, your child will do fine in public school because you'll be able to afford all the private tutors they need. And also, if they go to public school in Palo Alto, like, oh no, they're gonna have to settle for the like plebeian public school with the glass blowing classes, like with the nationally honored robotics teams. Like, oh no, man. I don't know. That's something that really has bothered me. I mean, like maybe they're adding students that are going to be from lower income areas from outside of Palo Alto and they will have a full ride scholarship. That would be great. That would really be supporting girls' education.
I don't know. I still think that would be supporting one girl's education. I feel less and less compelled to be like, oh, but they do this. Like, no. I had this discussion with somebody yesterday about how like we shouldn't be so hard on the new president because he hasn't even had a chance to do anything yet. But I just really am of the opinion, like, that's not my problem though. Like I don't feel compelled whatsoever to be nice to Joe Biden. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I feel compelled to be nice to anyone who has power and is withholding it.
What do you mean Joe Biden hasn't had time to do anything? He's had time to deport plenty of people. He had time to deport people. He has time to do good things,
Yeah, and then
like
there are people who understand that and also still fall on this sentiment of like, oh, but the only steps forward or the only steps possible are small steps. And I completely understand that. I just think it's a both and thing. Like, I will never be upset with groups that are continually reminding us this is not enough, this is not enough, even if they're abrasive about it, even if, they're rude about it. Like, people are so willing to say like, oh, but the politician's problem is that you're going to have to do a give and take. And I'm like, well, yeah, exactly. Like, they're going to have to give me what I want, and they're going to have to take it when I say it's not enough.
Like with Castellia, I'm like, I don't resent people for going there. Honestly, I wish I could have gone there. Exactly. It seems like a really great school. If I could have gone, I would have. And like, if people who send their kids there, like, I totally get it.
Of course.
You want your kid to have the best of the best, and that's the best of the best. It's even better than a public high school. But I'm also like, stop whining. Well,
I would even go further than that. Like, no, it doesn't make you a bad person to like spend money on your education. But also, like, what is so wrong with being like, yeah, you can only do this because there are systems of inequality upholding your decision? Like, why does it matter so much to you that you're a good person who also like gets to do all these good things? Just be a bad person. Like, what is the problem? Face reality, grow up. I had a professor because I minored in, the minor was called Child Development and Social Intervention. So it was specifically looking at like child development and child psychology through the lenses of like existing school and therapy infrastructures. So not purely like psych, not purely therapy, but like what is possible, what kind of interventions are possible for kids whose behavior is not suitable to their environment. One of my professors was like showing us all this information, and then he kind of built it into this point of like, the number one cause of mental illness is poverty. Poverty has such a huge impact on so many things in your life that all have their own impact on mental illness. And the sort of like logic behind restorative justice is also the idea that poverty creates crime. Like, of course, people can do crime without being poor. However, poverty in its own category also creates crime. I think another thing that goes with that I kind of realized while reading these texts is that like poverty and inequality, this sounds so stupid, like poverty and inequality are the same thing. So kind of solve poverty, make sure people have enough money, and you solve inequality. You know what I mean? Like, it's just one of those things, like, it has to click. Poor people don't not deserve money. And also, making poor people have money would probably solve a lot of problems or take us a huge step toward resolving a lot of the issues that are linked to inequality. Very, very basic, but...
This tangentially reminds me of something I saw, like, a post where people were talking about, like, screen time for children and like mental development, and they were talking about how often poor children have way more screen time than children who grow up in like richer households, because their parents are like really like at work, or they're like really exhausted from working multiple jobs or things like that, so they give their children an iPad, to keep them busy, because they don't have the energy to engage with them constantly in the way that wealthier parents are able to, because they just work shorter hours for more pay, and therefore can like really engage their child and give them that type of mental stimulation and growth that comes from that. And also they talked about how like if you want your child to paint something or do a puzzle or like, play mind games or things like that, you have to buy those games. You have to buy those craft supplies. You have to buy all those things. And it's a lot of money. And rich people can do that. They can buy paints for their kids. They can buy craft supplies. They can buy Play-Doh. They can set up a sandbox. They can buy them all these blocks. Whereas like if you're poor, if you can afford a monthly payment to like pay down an iPad, then you have an iPad and you can just download a bunch of free apps, and then you can just have your kid do all of those activities on the iPad. And how even from the get-go, something as like small as that has an impact on the like, mental development of children.
Before COVID, basically, I mean, like because of COVID, the place where I work, I think is shut down. I don't think it's reopening, but I used to work at a crisis nursery, which is like this 24-hour intake facility. It was this emergency intake facility. So if families knew, one of like their parents had to go into sort of like a hospital stay, or, we had one parent who was like having a baby and she just didn't have anyone to take care of her kids, they could enroll these kids for free, and we would provide every service. They had school in the classroom next door. We gave them all their meals. We gave them baths, like everything. It comes down to that thing where sometimes teachers will just send the bad kids to the punishing room because they cannot do their job because there are so many kids in the room. I had 8-hour shifts. Oh my God, can I play with them the whole time? Like, can I really play with it the whole time? Or am I going to turn on the freaking TV so I can like clean their room and like get their bath stuff together and like freaking make dinner for them, you know? And like we had at least 2 people staffing at the same time, but we could have up to 10 or 12 kids. And it was ages ranging all the way from like infant to 12 years old. Oh my goodness. Like, I'm really supposed to come into work, into my minimum wage job, and then think of like a craft for them to do every single day. One that's going to eat up at least a few hours? I don't think so. At a certain point, the kids start asking, can we watch Fortnite dances on YouTube? And you're like, okay, you know what I mean?
Like, please.
And like, if you're a parent, I mean, of course, I am being paid for that service, so I did do my best, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes your best is literally knowing when it's time to just turn on freaking YouTube, let them watch Fortnite dances. The best you can do is even remember, put in like clean in your search. Like one time a kid was like, can I watch TikToks? And I was like, okay. But I forgot to put clean in them. So they were all like just horrible. And then I had to be like, oh, hold on. And I don't know how to use the freaking Xbox controller to type. So it took me like forever. And that was my job. Parents have a whole nother job, you know, like, or their actual job where they make money.
I mean, that's what something else I read is that like people talk about how the 40-hour work week was designed assuming that you had a full-time like domestic worker at home, aka your wife. So if people are both like, if partners are both working 40 hours a week, there literally is just not enough time for you to raise your child and like do the laundry and maybe like work out a little bit. Like there's not enough time because 40 hours a week is set up assuming that you have someone who's staying home, cleaning the whole house and like raising the children.
And so how does it make sense that we're putting 30 to 40 kids into a classroom with one person for hours and hours? Like, it makes no sense. Having studied a lot of education policy, especially through my minor as well, I kind of have this, I don't even know what to call it. It's like a policy headcanon. It's like a legal headcanon that I have. I just really think we should make public schools a community center. Like we should just go all the way and make it a community center and give it the funding and the staffing to do that. Because already there's this idea of like the venerated teacher who gets up at 5 a.m. to pick up the kids because they can't be bussed in or whatever. They make their kids lunch and stuff like that. And they're doing it on $40,000 to $70,000 a year. Ridiculous that we have that expectation. And then so this breeds this resentment between teachers and parents, especially parents who are immigrants and don't necessarily speak English. It's like a huge problem within communities where there's lots of non-English speaking immigrants. But what if we just treated schools the way they are and gave them all of the funding to do that, make schools a place where parents can go for anything and get referrals, even for health services or for like after school services. Like instead of schools having to put together this funding for after school programs, why not just assume every school will have like 20-hour-a-day services? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like park ambulances at schools. I really think we need schools in every neighborhood, and we kind of have schools in every neighborhood. Just turn them into the community centers they're already straining to be, you know?
And that's going to be reliant on distributing funds more equally. It's another self-perpetuating cycle of wealth. Like you said, like poverty is really the root of it all. If you're like in a poor neighborhood, your school is not going to be well funded, so your children aren't going to be well taken care of. They're not going to be given the individual attention and resources that they need, and they're not going to be as likely to succeed. And then it's going to be harder for them to get on to higher education, and from higher education to higher paying jobs. And the cycle of poverty continues because they were set up to fail from the start. And then, of course, the opposite is true in predominantly rich, aka predominantly white neighborhoods.
And California actually has one of the more liberal, and I'm using liberal instead of progressive, right? More liberal funding policies. They do have like a certain block of income tax go to the state, which redistributes them equally to school districts. Equally, I'm not sure if it means like, I'm sure it doesn't mean a lump sum, but like per student or whatever. And there are people in Palo Alto actively fighting those policies because, well, one, they understand it's like progressive goals, but they don't feel like it's achieving them, like, which is fair. But the second thing is like they want to protect the money that they're putting into this neighborhood, especially, I mean, think about it. We were just talking about this with like Castellea, right? Like, it's not just hyper rich people who live here. It's people who want their kids to one day become hyper rich. And so there's this even non-racialized, of course it is super racialized, but even non-racialized model minority that's coming in, where it is like immigrant families, or it is like sort of well-to-do upper middle class people who they worked really hard in order to be able to afford very little in a rich ass neighborhood like Palo Alto, you know. Sometimes it breeds resentment against these like hyper rich people around them, but most of the time it creates this sense of inferiority, and it enforces this merit-based view on class.
I took a ceramics class in high school. We had a really gorgeous ceramics studio. We had a bunch of like wheels that were like nearly brand new. We had tons of clay. We had a little outdoor area, which actually like had like, it was like a little fenced in yard that you could only access to the ceramics room. And like it had some trees in there, a little hammock, and like we had a bunch of different kilns. We had some like, you know, really massive ones. So we had like all these resources, but there'd be like 1 or 2 ceramics classes a semester because there weren't enough students signing up for it, but it was just, you know, there. And I went, I can't remember where it was. It was someplace in like the East Bay. A friend of mine, family friend, is a teacher. She taught at that school in the East Bay. I went with her to speak to her class about art school in terms of colleges, and I saw the ceramics room there. And the ceramics was like the most popular class in school. Like kids were fighting to be in that class. They were maxed out every year, but they had zero funding. The guy told me that he gets like less than $100 a year in funding for his like class resources. And so what he did, the man who was running the ceramics class, he like sold his own work to support the class. And he was telling me, he's like, yeah, like over the years, like the amount of work I've sold to support this class, I've put in literally hundreds of thousands of like dollars, like insane amounts of money into this. And like he had hand built wheels from like thrown away parts to create like enough, like literally he told me everything in that class he had built by hand from like discarded wheels and like repairing things. I think there was one thing he had bought. It was like this special pen for glazing, but everything else he had built from scratch. And it was just insane to see the difference.
These are the teachers that are held as like a good teacher, which totally puts out other teachers, right? Like if you don't want to devote your life savings to saving this like stupid little class in a school, like, you know, if you don't want to get up at 5 a.m. to drive your students to school, if you don't want to like receive super heart-wrenching emails from them, and like, you know, like,
yeah,
no teacher should have to do that without support. And we need to understand the reality of what roles teachers play. Oh my God. And here's a whole nother thing, right? Like in rich neighborhoods, in rich communities, usually teachers are not even living in those communities. So this incredible resource that is technically making that community so rich, just in terms of culture and also in terms of straight up money, the resources that these teachers don't even belong to us. They belong to other neighborhoods, belong to other communities.
It's like you said, like when it comes to education, like we want our teachers to be martyrs for us. Like we don't want to just fund them properly so that children can have resources. We want to watch the teachers like suffer. It's like those heartwarming stories. Like what was that one recently where it's like girl gives up her college fund to pay her mom's rent? And everyone's like, why did she even have to do that? You know, like people tell these heartwarming stories about teachers, like that ceramics teacher who I met, who like, he was a great guy. He's wonderful. He really loves his student and he is a great teacher, but he's like telling you about like literally the thousands of dollars he's put in this class by selling his own work, and like how he like essentially lives there to help out all the kids. And I'm like, damn, like why did you have to do that? Like clearly it was something that brought him joy, so like that's good, but like they should have just funded him.
It could have easily also gone the other way. He could have become extremely jaded. He could have become extremely resentful. He could have felt like, oh, these kids don't deserve it. He could have taken it out on kids that were Black and brown. You know what I mean? So sometimes there are these profiles of schools that are doing amazing things with the tiny amount of funding they have. And like people are always writing these profiles on them, like always writing these articles like, oh, this is a new way of schooling and stuff. But like, why don't we just change the rules of a freaking game, you know?
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of circle back to restorative justice by asking this question. Restorative justice ideas and like the structure itself comes from Indigenous tribes, Indigenous peoples. And the reason why we still talk about it often in the context of, or like tribal courts is, of course, because tribal courts exist. There have been stories in the news in which tribal courts are beseeching state courts to let them try Indigenous criminals in their own courts because they have a different way of law. They have a different principle of law and justice and fairness. And so sometimes that does happen. Acorn says that, you know, it doesn't seem like the state court wants to back out. So as long as they are involved in Indigenous matters, they should like work openly with them and like try to involve both systems of justice. But I was wondering if that idea, communities trying their own members, to what extent is that applicable to the classroom or the district or the school? Like if there are these amazing schools, let's say that the principals and the teachers really are on the side of students. Like, can this happen? Would this work?
I can only speak from my own experience. And as I've said before, I went to a special elementary school that was like an alternative learning elementary school that was supposed to be more community based. It was a public school. You got into it by like joining a lottery because a lot of people wanted to go to it, but it was a public school. So there was a mix of incomes. And there were people from outside of the immediate Palo Alto area who attended it as well. And they did a couple of things. For example, classrooms weren't just kindergarten, first grade, second grade. It was kindergarten and first grade together, second and third grade together, fourth and fifth grade together. You come in as a younger, and then when you become an older, great terminology we had for them. Part of the role of becoming an older is that you were paired with a younger in your years and older, and you became their mentor, and you were expected to teach them about the classroom rules and the classroom communities. I mean, I had a particularly excellent fourth and fifth grade teacher who was like a community fixture. He taught my mother, he taught my older sister, he taught me, he taught my younger brother. But this was the policy he had in his class, but I believe the other teachers had this as well, is at the beginning of the years, we as students created our classroom rules. We had a big sheet of paper and we had a whole like brainstorming thing where we all participated, talked about like the values that we had and like, you know, what were the rules we wanted to have enforced in our classroom, and that like you would hang it on the wall and that would be there throughout the full year for us to reference back to, that we created our own sort of constitution as a classroom is what he called it, I think. Things like that, or like disciplinary action involved both like, you know, the student who's wrong and the student who did the wronging. If people got into a fight or an argument, they would like both be pulled aside, and they like, you know, the person who was like, you know, maybe one kid hit the other, the kid who was hit would be like, you know, I'm hurt or I'm angry or upset because of XYZ, and talk about it. And like, you know, the other kid would have to apologize. And the thing is, those were all great policies and they definitely influenced me as a person. And it's certainly better than like the alternative of a more normative education. But there was still like, we had very few Black students, which is partially because of the racial makeup of our town. But we had like 2 Black students and they got sent to the principal's office like every other day. No other student got sent that often. As much as it was like cool, this like liberal haven and this new way of like education thinking, that didn't truly fix the issue because I don't think the racial biases of the teachers were ever truly fully addressed.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, restorative justice is definitely not a remedy for racism. Letting communities try their own members through, you know, that community context that no one coming from the outside would necessarily know, that an outer court might not necessarily pay attention to. Hopefully the benefit of the doubt is there, but it could also go the other way where the labeling power is so strong that people within the community are like, well, of course, they just are the troublemaker. They're just known as the troublemaker, you know.
Restorative justice and justice based in and by the community is great, but you also need to take into account what that community is and how that community was formed. And the community I lived in was predominantly white, and it was formed through white identity and through wealth.
In the McClure reading, so that article was specifically profiling this one judge, Judge Abby Abinanti of the Yurok Tribal Court. She lives in San Francisco, so I don't really know if that's where the tribal court is. she also said, like, it also said that she drove up the West Coast every weekend, so maybe that's where it is. I'm not sure. In the article, it like talked about this one case in which this woman was trying to get a restraining order from her violent ex-husband, who was imprisoned at the time, but he was like set to release, and no like traditional court would grant it. But then this judge who tries to work restorative justice into her practice was the only one to grant the restraining order. And then she also offered all of these other things, which is like, you know, monitored communication with his kids, a rehab program that he can attend, and also getting his like gang tattoos removed, all like funded by the tribe. To me, it reminded me of another article on restorative justice that I read, where this woman was charged with, like, she met a bunch of kids who, like, kid, you learn about what's good and what's bad and what's wrong and what's right. And so it makes sense, like, you're punished for the bad things you do. So she had to explain to them why restorative justice wasn't letting the bad person get away. And she was talking about how in Spain, the rates of murder are extremely low. But when somebody does murder someone, the average sentence is only 7 years or something like that. And they were like, that's horrible. Like, but that person killed somebody. They took their life and stuff. And she was like, well, if you're in a system that values life, you would also value the life of the person who committed that crime, you know? To me, those two examples together kind of point to this more is more attitude in terms of rehabilitation and preventing crime. Ultimately, the ex-husband didn't take up any of the services, and he did end up assaulting and threatening the woman again.
I know, I think it's kind of a balance to what I've seen with, I see a lot of things on the internet that sort of oscillate between like forgive and forget. It feels almost like kind of a gaslighting the victims when they're like, you know, you need to like forgive and like let go of your anger because like you're only hurting yourself, versus like, you know, you have the right to be angry if someone harmed you. And restorative action, I feel like people dismiss it because, or restorative justice, people dismiss it because it sounds too much like the just forgive idea, where it's like, oh, you just need to let go and move on, but it's not about forgiving and forgetting. It's about finding a way to address your rightful anger in a constructive way, and allowing that person to, even if you don't forgive them for their actions, like allowing themselves to forgive themselves, assuming they're able to take that amount of accountability.
The philosophy behind imprisonment, there's two things, right? You go to, it's basically timeout. You reflect on your actions for whatever number of years in a horrible environment with no free will whatsoever. And also there's this idea of removing dangerous people from society. But so often people come out and they're so stripped of their own resources, it puts them right back in that seat in the classroom where your principal walks by and they're like, well, considering his behavior, his resources, everything, like, he's probably going to prison. It's not that poor people don't make it out of the hood or whatever and do amazing things. It's that is such an incredible exception. It is so incredible that people are able to do that. It takes so much discipline. It takes so much good decision making, smart decision making. It takes so much like making the most of your resources. It is truly incredible that anyone escapes a prescriptive path to prison, to their outcomes.
And that's the thing, like with wealthy people or people with privileges, like, oh, why don't poor people just like work harder? Like they should have just studied hard and gotten to college. And they see it as if it's that simple, but they don't see that it's way, way more complex than that. And it's not just like, oh, you should have studied a little harder in math class, then you would have gotten into college and gotten a good job, then you wouldn't be poor anymore. It's like, if you have to work a part-time job after school to support your family, then you don't have time to study. Or like, what if you don't have Wi-Fi? What if you don't have the books, etc.? It's way more complex. And I saw something really on the internet, of course, that succinctly summed it up for me, which was, you didn't make good choices, you had good choices. And I feel like that's kind of really key. It's not that poor people or people of color make bad choices, it's that they're given bad options from the get-go. Or like if you're given all bad choices, then like even if you pick the best choice out of many bad choices, you're still going to be derided for having made a bad choice.
And so if you're a parent who you can either spend $20 buying paper and paint that are all going to be disposed of after a number of painting sessions or whatever. Or you can make monthly payments on an iPad and download free games. It is a genius logical move to choose the iPad. And this is like a founding principle of liberal economics, right? People make the best choices they can with the limited information they get. Like adding that limited information was a huge step for liberal people to be like, oh yeah, you know, like we don't always have the capability to make the best choices. But I don't think we know just how hard people are thinking in order to just get around like the shitty options they're presented with. This has been Roosevelt Trash. This month's theme is Narratives of Healing. And you can follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you would get your podcasts. Also follow us on Instagram at Roosevelt Trash or our personal Instagrams at RRRYEN.
And Catherine.Sher.
See you next week.
Bye.